Hey, welcome to Devlog number 4. My name is Patrick Cook. This is project GBPL, which is a project which explores how to leverage 3D game technology for learning real-world photography. Now, what I want to do in this devlog is begin to look at the asset that I purchased a license for up on the Unreal Engine marketplace. The asset's name is Photo Arch Mode by UMKA Apps, which I believe is pronounced UMKA Apps. Now, the purpose for me having purchased this particular photo mode asset was so that I could include in the Project GBPL prototype a, functionality that would closely simulate a real-world camera. Now, as I've talked about in previous devlogs, the whole idea is to use 3D game technology to simulate a camera and photography opportunities close enough where the learner, the player, is able to actually learn in the simulated environment and then be able to translate that learning to a real-world photographic situation. Now, that would imply that you want to have a simulated camera behavior which is very close to the real-world physical camera. But what I'm interested in right now today is not so much the image capture, but the menu items that would set the properties for the simulated camera. Because again, now what we're trying to do is to get as close to the behavior of a real-world camera as we possibly can to make sure that the simulated game environment is going to provide good camera and photography learning. All right, so what I've done is I have called up the viewfinder, a simulated viewfinder. This is modified. I've modified the photo arch mode asset in order to get it to do some of the things that I wanted it to do in terms of learning photography with a simulated environment. Now, if I take a picture, I can certainly point. I can point my camera, my simulated camera, and I can take a picture. All right, now I can point my simulated camera, you see. I can point it around, and I can take a picture. There we go. That inset in the lower left, that's me. I added that functionality because I felt that it would be important for the learner, the player, to be able to actually see the image that they just took. All right, let's take another shot. Let's do something like that. Okay, so there we go. And all of these images will actually go into an album, and this album is included in the Photo Arch Mode asset. Now, for purposes of this devlog, what I want to do is to take a look at the menu capabilities of this this asset. Now, this is a nice feature. The asset allows the aspect ratio to be changed of the view. All right. However, the rest of the screen is not changing with it. Now, that's just something I have to do, where you can see here the outline. This is the edge of the frame. And if I go full frame, you see we get more of a square. I can do the DSLR 16 by 9. You see, but my my inset my viewfinder is not following the camera change. I'm not really sure whether or not that is going to be a function which is useful in a learning environment. However, it's here and it's part of the asset and it's pretty nice. It works pretty well. All right, but I'm just going to leave it here for the moment. What I'm mostly interested in for this devlog is the exposure capabilities, this section right in here. All right, that's what I'm mostly interested in for this devlog. So now this asset permits auto exposure and manual exposure. Now, what I found is that this capability tracks a physical camera pretty well. Let's just start with auto exposure. Now, certainly like a real camera, I have the field of view. This would be equivalent to adjusting a zoom lens. All right, so I have that. That's fine. That's great. That's good. It works good. Now, I also have camera roll here, which I'm not really sure whether or not it's something I'm going to keep. I may actually tear this out and not utilize it. There might be some other ways where I can roll the camera, you know, have the character tilt the camera. But anyway, it's there. It's good to know it's there. Now, I'm really focused on aperture, ISO, and exposure compensation. This color temperature, we're going to talk about that in another devlog. All right, nice little feature. Replicates to some degree what we know in a physical camera as white balance. But for now, we're just going to leave that alone. I'm interested in aperture, ISO, and exposure compensation. Now, one of the first things I noticed that when I acquired the asset is that there is no shutter control on this particular design. All right, I'm not really sure why. I haven't spoken with the author of this particular asset. I'm not really sure why that is, but that's okay. What I'm probably going to wind up doing is integrating, building in the shutter capability, or I should say shutter control capability, into this asset so that it more closely represents what you'll find in a real-world camera. Now, speaking of real-world camera, I have here, I have a Sony a6000 that I have rigged up where I can actually show the menu of the camera. This is a Sony a6000 mirrorless, and I've rigged it up so that we can actually see how the various controls of the camera impact exposure. And I want to be able to compare this to the simulated camera. So I've just put the camera into manual mode, and you can see that I can actually change the aperture, which is good. That's what I want. This is in manual mode now. And we can see that I can also change the shutter speed. Okay. Now back to the simulated camera. I can change the aperture, but there is no shutter control in this particular asset, which is not a terrible thing. But anyway, it's there. Now, in auto exposure, I should not be able to modify the aperture, all right, according to the behavior of a real-world camera. If I was to go into auto mode right there, that's in auto mode. Now I am unable to modify the aperture. So automatic exposure mode implies that the camera will be determining what is the best aperture, the best ISO, and the best exposure compensation given the metering that the camera performs. So in auto, I should not have control of the aperture. Now, in this Sony a6000 mirrorless camera, you can't really see it here, but I cannot, in auto mode, I cannot adjust the exposure compensation. And that's also true with the DSLR that I have. However, in the asset allows me to modify the exposure compensation. All right, so here's the point. When I'm in auto mode, I should not be able to modify the exposure or the ISO or the exposure compensation, because the point is that the camera has determined the exposure and has adjusted the aperture and the ISO accordingly, and the shutter speed accordingly, and that's it. You're done. You let the camera do the work. So, to more closely represent a real-world camera, this aperture control should be disabled, and the exposure compensation should be disabled, and of course the ISO should be disabled, and also the shutter should be disabled. Now, if I put this Sony a6000 into, say, program mode. Now, program mode, as you may know, what the camera does is it decides what the best exposure is, but still gives you some control to be able to override that exposure. So let's go ahead and click that. Now let's put this in manual mode. Okay. Now in program mode, all right, I am able to adjust the aperture. Good. That's the aperture. I'm just going back and forth. There's the aperture. I'm going to just leave it at 5.6 for the moment. Back to the simulated camera. In manual exposure, I should be able to adjust the aperture, and I can. So that's good. All right. And in a previous devlog, devlog number 2, I actually talked about how the aperture will impact the depth of field within, and the depth of field behavior is close to the real-world physical camera. But to stay on the point here, in manual exposure, I can adjust the aperture, which I can with the physical camera. I can adjust the ISO. Now I'm going to go over to the physical camera, and I'm going to, all right, there we go. So I can adjust the ISO as well. I'm in program mode here in the a6000 mirrorless camera, and I'm just going to go ahead and select that 100 ISO. Exposure compensation is I'm allowed. As I pointed out before, I do not have in the simulated camera, I do not have the shutter speed, but I do in my physical camera. Okay? Now, let's talk about exposure compensation. All right. Now the question is, can I get to exposure compensation in the Sony a6000 physical camera? Let me give it a shot. So here's the button. Okay, good. All right. So in program mode, I am able to adjust the exposure compensation. Now what that exposure compensation is that I'm able to override what the camera is determining is the proper exposure. The camera is assuming that exposure, EV exposure setting number 0 is the correct exposure given the shutter speed and aperture setting selection, I should say. So let me go back now. So that is what the camera is determining is the exposure based upon a shutter speed of 1/60 and a f-stop of f4.0. I can override that with exposure compensation. Now back to the game. I can set the aperture. I can set the ISO. I cannot set the shutter because the setting is not available. The property in the Unreal Engine camera, the property for shutter speed is available. This particular asset did not bring that shutter control forward. And I can adjust the exposure compensation. So this exposure capability in this asset is behaving pretty much as program mode that you would find in a physical camera. It's not behaving in the aperture priority. That's aperture priority. Aperture priority is where the camera decides the aperture based upon its metering. The camera operator gets to decide the ISO and the shutter speed. The camera decides the aperture. Now, can I get to exposure compensation and aperture priority? Yes. Now, let's go to shutter priority. This is where the camera determines the shutter. The camera operator determines the aperture and the ISO. Now, can I get to exposure compensation? Yes. All right. Good. So now let's go to manual mode. In manual mode, the camera operator determines the shutter, the aperture, and the ISO. All right. So here's manual mode. So I can determine the aperture, the f-stop. I can determine the shutter speed. All right. I can determine the ISO. There we go. Okay. Can I get to exposure compensation? No. The camera does not allow me to dial up exposure compensation. And probably the design behind that is because the settings that you select for the aperture, the shutter, and the ISO determines the exposure. So you don't need exposure compensation. You don't need an exposure override. All right, so now back to the game. So what we see here is that in manual exposure, this capability is acting very much as if it is a camera, a physical camera in program mode, P mode. Okay? And in P mode, we should have a shutter control here, which we don't here. I'll add that. We do have control over the aperture, the ISO, and the exposure compensation in priority mode. All right. In manual mode, in a physical camera, we do not have exposure compensation. We don't need it because our aperture, our shutter, and our ISO determine the exposure. We don't need exposure compensation. Okay. All right. So I think what we've determined here is that this photo arch mode asset in manual mode is pretty close to the behavior of a physical camera. It's one of the reasons why I chose this asset over 3 or 4 others that were up on the Unreal Marketplace. So that's good. So this is good. So this is close. Got to add a shutter, add shutter control here, and back over on auto exposure. The user should not have access to exposure compensation in order to replicate a physical camera. All right. Basically, they should not be able to override the aperture because the camera is deciding all of that in auto exposure. All right, so I think that's good enough for this devlog. What I'm going to do in another devlog is take a look at the focusing capabilities of the asset. compared to a real-world camera. In another devlog, we're also going to take a look at some of these extended capabilities of this asset. But what I'm really trying to do here is I want to keep moving this project toward being a close simulation of of a real-world camera in order to be able to have a learning environment which is very close to what we'd find with a real physical camera, because this project is really all about learning photography using 3D game simulation. So this pretty much describes the prototype as we have it today, and today is February 20th in 2022. So that's the state of where we're at. So take a look at the previous devlogs if you want to kind of catch up on the project. And like I say, I'm going to do another devlog, and we're going to talk about this focusing capabilities, and then we'll keep moving the project forward. All right? Hey, so thanks for joining me. Hey, come on up, join us up on the Discord, Project GBPL server. Get involved with the discussion, help move this project forward. So again, thanks for joining me today, and you have a great day. Bye-bye.